Hello, and welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and a software developer at Axonic, Sara. In this episode, I spoke with three of my colleagues from the Axon Server team, Mark Gattier, Michal Negach, and Marco Aman, about our newest product, Axon Synapse. They explained what the Synapse is, how you can use it, and where would be the best use case to use the Synapse, and what are some of the pitfalls as well. I hope you enjoy this episode, and let's have a listen. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me today. I have Mark, Michal, and Marco with me from the Axon Server team talking about an exciting new product that we have, Axon Synapse. So let's start with you, Mark. Can you please tell us what is the Synapse anyways, and how did the idea come about?
Okay, so we've had Axon Server out for a long time, and we get more and more questions from other people in the world saying, okay, I want to use Axon Server, but I'm not using Axon Framework. And I have this nice application created in Python, and why can't it use Axon Server? So that's why we started working on Axon Synapse. Axon Synapse is a tool that will allow you to interact with Axon Server in an easy way.
So, in other words, as you mentioned, it doesn't really need any other prerequisites like the framework. You can have it with any kind of application that you're using and just connect easily with the
That's
server,
true.
correct?
Yes, you can connect to Synapse using HTTP, so it can be used from any language that can understand HTTP.
Nice. And I'm glad you brought up HTTP because I will go back to it and have some questions on that in just a few minutes. But let me go to Michal and ask. So we did talk a little bit about what is the Synapse and why it came about. But what about the name? Why did we pick Synapse?
So while developing the Synapse, we had a few ideas about names, and we had also a few conversations which name to pick, because at first it wasn't obvious. Yeah, so we had a few ideas, a few conversations about the Synapse, and we fall back to biology, where axon exists as a cell, as a neuron that transmits signals from one cell to another. And this axon, it has a special part, a special place at the very end of its leg, called synapse, which allows transmitting those signals to other different cells like muscles. So we brought this analogy to our world, to um, well, the world of developing software. We already had the Axon Server, which is responsible for transmitting messages, right, from one application to another. And then we have Synapse, which is responsible for connecting Axon to with other systems. Hence the name Synapse, because, well, the analogy is quite obvious when we think about it.
Yes, definitely. And I had a personal note here that I was kind of geeking out on different neurons and how the messages are transmitted within our biological system. And a couple of years ago, I had some medical issues and so on. And so I was reading a lot about these, and I had just joined Axon at that time. And I remember having this funny conversation with Alar saying, "Oh my God, now I really get the name Axon." And I was like, totally geeking out on it. And he was chuckling. And I was like, yes, so the synapse totally makes sense. And I think it's a perfect fit. And as we go on and explain a little bit about the functionality of it, I think it makes even more sense. So great about the name, but how does it exactly work?
Uh, well, as the name suggests, it translates signals or messages from Axon Server uh, to the language, to the published language that can be interpreted by all other systems. Currently, this published language is well, the plain HTTP, because this one is pretty simple and it is most widely supported by other systems. We think about introducing other languages, so Synapse can also speak other different protocols. But so far, that's the main responsibility of the Synapse to translate Axon Server functionality, Axon Server capabilities, so other applications can understand it.
Gotcha. So then it basically, instead of creating various plugins or connectors for that matter, we can just use the Synapse. Now, speaking of connectors, Marco, let me ask you this one. What is then the difference between Synapse and a connector? And if you do have both of them available, which one would you pick?
So our Axon Server connector is a library you add to your own code, and therefore it is required that you are on the JVM because we currently have the main connector for the JVM. Synapse, on the other hand, just offers an HTTP API that you can use, and since basically all serious programming languages have some sort of HTTP capabilities, we got a wider field with Synapse. And yeah, there are many more benefits. We'll get to them later. Another question: which one you should pick, and that again depends. If you're on the JVM and are okay with a bit tighter coupling, I would definitely opt for the connector. If you are on a different system or need some looser coupling, we get later to some serverless stuff, then the Synapse approach really shines.
Gotcha. So speaking about that, if the Synapse is simpler than the existing API, so why not make the existing API simpler instead of going through this all rigmarole and create a Synapse?
So one thing is that we want to not only make it simpler, but also extend it. We have functionality like, for example, the admin API that won't, at the current state, be exposed in Synapse. These are things, all these, let's say, edge applications don't need to know. They don't need to know that there is Axon Server behind that. But we definitely need to keep that in the original API. So we need to streamline that a bit. And expanding the functionality is towards making the component, let's say Synapse or Axon Server, being able to call your application. For example, if you have an event, then you can register a callback, and that's a new functionality. We currently have not implemented that in Axon Server. And to make scalability and management easier, we decided we'll put that into a separate component.
I see. So then another question about if the Synapse is simpler. So what features would the user lose compared to the existing API if they're using the Synapse? Are they losing
Uh,
any features
yeah.
or not really?
For example, the admin API, that's
Mm,
not the main target that we want to expose.
yeah.
We have some stronger guarantees about liveness in the connectors because it's more connection oriented. We especially went for a less connection oriented approach in Synapse. So if you have these serverless applications that are scaled to zero, there is no connection, but they're still in quotes alive. So the liveness there is a bit more spongy.
Very good. These are really great benefits, and there are obviously some drawbacks. For instance, using the admin API, it's not very much possible with only using the Synapse. So um, now that kind of goes back, I suppose, to then why would I use the Axon server if you can use the Synapse? Because you will lose a certain functionalities or features within the server that you might need for your certain use case. Um, so what does Synapse then do for a user other than bringing just the protocols? Um, if they can just produce that themselves easily.
And that's true. We have the normal Axon Server API as a public protobuf, so you could easily bridge protocols. But Synapse does more. For example, it does all the heavy lifting of keeping the state of the connections and keeping a state of registered endpoints. And you would have to implement all that of yourself, including authentication, error handling, life cycle of applications, and recycling the channels. So that would be a lot of work. We're exposing that in the Synapse.
Gotcha. So let's go back. I'm gonna then go back to Mark and ask this question that I've had myself as well when we were talking about the Synapse and the benefits of it and so on. So we did talk a bit about protocols. Now, Axon Server is known for using the gRPC protocol, right? Why does Synapse then use HTTP? Is it going backwards? Are we kind of moving away from latest technologies, or was it? I'm sure there was a reason to it. So can you please tell everybody what that was and why did we pick HTTP?
Okay, as the initial protocol for Synapse, we chose HTTP because, well, it's the most commonly known protocol to all languages. So all languages have easy access to it, easy integration with it, whereas gRPC is already a step further away.
Gotcha. And which HTTP are we using for the Synapse? 1 or 2?
It's HTTP 1.
Mm-hmm. And I think I had this short conversation with Michael a while ago. Why did we pick 1? Just out of curiosity.
Again, it's because it's still the most commonly used version.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So why not then use an Axon Server HTTP API instead?
It's a pretty good question. We want Axon Server to be stable product that doesn't really change much and provide backward compatibility. Synapse is a new product. It's at the beginning of its evolution. So therefore, we think that it may evolve rapidly in the nearest future. So that's why we'd like to not to constrain it with Axon Server lifecycle, but to detach it for now until it is really mature and really stable to be incorporated into Axon Server itself.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about integrating it then with applications. Marco, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about the benefits of using the Synapse and Axon Server to integrate an Axon Framework based application with the outside world instead of the building HTTP endpoints into the application itself.
What you just described is one possible way that your Axon Framework application exposes its own HTTP endpoints, but then you're mixing two approaches to get data and let's say signals in, once through the normal Axon Framework stuff, and the other one through HTTP. And to make that encapsulation a bit easier, bridging that with Synapse allows you to use Synapse to bridge from HTTP to our, let's say, the Axonic world, and from there stay in the mindset and lingo of the commands, queries, and events, and thereby you get a way cleaner architecture of the whole thing. And of course, all the other benefits like scaling, buffering, and so on.
Gotcha. So can you tell us a little bit about those other benefits as well? I know you mentioned a little bit about scaling and buffering. Can you go a little bit deeper into that?
One thing that is currently a bit hard to do because Axon Server is so connection oriented with gRPC is load balancing. So load balancing Axon servers, or let's say put Axon Server behind transparent load balancers. But that's something our customers request from time to time. And we therefore thought, okay, if we're using HTTP, and HTTP is a quite easy to proxy protocol, we should build it in a way that whichever instance you get through the load balancer, it should work with Synapse in that case. So that's one, operational benefit.
So then will Synapse work better with load balancers than Axon Server itself?
You can't mess it up that easily.
Okay, good. That's good to know. Right. I like that answer. You just can't mess it up easily. You really have to try hard to do it. Right.
Okay.
So,
And there's
so
one
then,
pitfall though.
yeah.
The other way, when you have your application registered as an event handler, it has to be called by the Synapse,
Hmm.
and you need to ensure that the same routing key that we use internally is routed to the correct instance. And if you
Okay.
place a load balancer there, you need to pay a bit of attention. So
Hmm.
that's one bit of a drawback, but that's definitely a solvable problem.
Right. Not too difficult to tackle, definitely. Um, any other functionalities the Synapse would add to the other Axonic products that we have that you can think of?
It makes it way easier to add the Axon Server into your landscape
Hmm.
with existing systems. And if you develop stuff in new languages, let's say Go or Rust, you can also integrate that not only with Axon Server, but also your already existing Axon Framework applications.
Very good. So that's there's a lot of possibilities then out there, which is something really beneficial for any user that wants to use this product. So let me go back to you, Michal, and talk a little bit about running the applications when they're using Spring, Axon Framework, and Server. What does the Synapse then mean to somebody who is using all of the above, basically? And can they use it with Axon Framework? We did talk about that a little bit, but tell me a
Mhm.
little bit more about it.
It depends.
I
Our
love the it depends answer.
favorite answer, of course.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yep. So in the basic use case, when we have one standalone monolithic application that uses Axon Framework and Axon Server, and we don't predict any evolution towards different languages, different paradigms like protocol. We'd like to stay within Java, within JVM world. Uh, then Synapse kind of really doesn't offer much to us.
Gotcha.
However, if we work in the modern development landscape, which is getting more and more diverse, which combines different teams that uses different technologies. And for instance, in my product, one team uses Axon Framework and Axon Server, another team uses Node.js, and yet
Hmm.
another team uses, let's say, function as a service. Uh, then all the teams may benefit from the integration with each other from Axon Synapse. So
Gotcha.
it depends on your exact development landscape,
Hmm.
on your evolution path, and your architecture.
May I
Right. Makes
just
sense.
chip in here for a moment?
Yes, of course.
I would also argue that if you run the JVM, Synapse can benefit you in certain cases. Let's
Hmm.
say you have a large legacy application and you want to connect that to some already existing Axon framework stuff. You can't just bring in the framework into a huge existing monolithic application without significant effort,
Yeah.
but you can add a little bit of HTTP glue to enable the communication. So I think that might also be a nice use case.
Yeah,
Sure.
definitely.
Mhm.
That's right. Which I think has been the use case for some of our customers, also than some of the folks that I've spoken with during the podcast. When you do have a monolithic application, but you also have other applications using the framework, how do we kind of get to a point where we can connect these two, or we can kind of move away from that monolithic application and make it more distributed? What ways we can do that a little bit more easily? So this is really great that you mentioned that. Thank you. So what about then Micronauts, Quarkus, or a different Java framework? Can they
Mhm.
also benefit from this?
Yes, yes, they can. As there are two possibilities. So we are still within the JVM ecosystem. So as
Hmm.
Marco previously mentioned, we have
Yeah.
an option, an alternative, which is good. We can choose from Axon connector, which gives us greater control, greater possibilities. However, it requires from us to be configured, to be coded, to be integrated, which isn't simple.
Right.
So this is the one possibility. If we want to have that greater control, then go for Axon connector. However, if you'd like to simply integrate with Axon Server and still stay within JVM ecosystem, then the Synapse is an option,
Right.
because it allows for quite simple, hassle-less integration, well, with Micronaut, with Quarkus, or any other Java framework that we don't support out of the box.
Right, right. I like Marco's glue example, so you can really use it as a glue to basically connect anything, which is really great. Mark, let me go back to you and talk a little bit about Axon Server Standard Edition. Can the users use the Synapse with the Standard Edition as well?
Yes, it's completely possible. So you can use it with Standard Edition, you can use it with Enterprise Edition, you can even use it with Axon Cloud. So all these combinations are possible.
Nice. So then will the Synapse allow the user to apply the event sourcing patterns then using any language that they want to use with the Synapse? Or does it have nothing to do with it?
It will enable you to do it because you can retrieve events specifically for an aggregate. There's some concurrency control over it, but you still have to do some of the work yourself, of course. It's not a complete Axon framework.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit, maybe a couple of examples of some of the things that the user has to do on their side to be able to um, use the Synapse in order to be able to do event sourcing? Of course, we don't have the
Um,
nice, simple framework behind it. So what kind of things do they need to really do? Do they need to write out basically their own framework in a way?
they have to do some things themselves. So if they receive a command for an aggregate, they have to source that aggregate in some
Hmm.
way. And of course, Synapse provides an option to do that, but still the logic of applying the events to get to rebuild the state of the aggregate has to be done by the customer itself.
Okay, so Michal, let me come back to you and ask you this one about designing an application using CQRS. Will the Synapse help with that?
Well, CQRS stands for Command Query Responsibility Separation. This is an architectural pattern that favors designing application in two stacks. One stack that uses commands and handles commands. It is responsible for processing business logic and taking decisions. And later, those decisions are propagated to another stack that is responsible for handling, hmm, let's put it, the boring part of an application. So queries, views, read models. This pattern uses language like commands, events, and queries to mm, as this pattern components. And Synapse fully supports all of these event types, as Axon Framework does and as Axon Server does. So all three products from the Axon family supports developers in designing applications using CQRS.
That's really great. Um, so now, Mark briefly mentioned connection to the cloud. Let me come to you, Marco, with a couple of questions on that, or maybe one even. Um, how can the Synapse be used with the serverless or going scale to zero approach?
Before I answer that, let me just quickly outline why that's currently a bit hard to
Hmm.
do with Axon Server
Right.
itself. So how it currently works is that we have a connection from the client, so that's basically your application, to the Axon server. And when there is a new event coming, so I just explained it with the event type message. When there's a new event, over that existing connection, Axon server signals, yo, here, that's your new event, and you can process it. When you scale to 0, that means your application is not running, but is invoked from the outside. So it can't keep open the connection to Axon server, and therefore can't be notified. So we got a bit of a problem there. We changed that with Synapse. Synapse can call your application, and with this initial invoking, your application can be woken up from this scale to 0 to scale to 1 or multiple, depending on what you configure, in case there is a new event. That if this is a cold start, it might be a bit of a delay, but after it is a warm start, then it should be quite fast. There is, however, a bit of the challenge I mentioned earlier with making sure that the routing is consistent, but that's a different story.
Okay, so that's great. To wrap it up now, where can you find this wonderful Synapse, Mark?
Right now we have an early access version of it available, and I think we can share the link.
Definitely, I'll share it through the notes. Yeah. So can you briefly tell me and our listeners what is coming up next? Can you give me any sort of insight, or it's still in the discussions? And
next, of course, will be the official version, because we only have an early access version. And from there on, we'll be continuing with some other features that we still have to prioritize.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely, I highly recommend everybody to give it a try and give us a feedback and let us know. That way we can use that feedback in order to find out what kind of features are mostly used or asked for. And that's always helpful on our side as well. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me today and giving everybody a great insight as to what the Synapse is and how they can use it, and what is the best way to use it, and some of the downsides as well, because that's also important to know. Really appreciate everybody's time, and I'll come back to you, I'm sure, at some point in the future to talk more about the Synapse and some of the other Axon Server functionalities as well. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to my talk with some of our Axon Server team members about Axon Synapse. Please join me next time for other amazing topics with wonderful guests. Until then, have a great time and happy coding!